In 1995, 5 American missionaries ventured deep into the Amazon rainforest to establish contact with the isolated Yanapuma tribe and were never seen again. For 20 years, their families clung to hope while search teams found nothing but empty jungle and unanswered questions. But when a weathered Yanapuma tribesman emerged from the forest depths carrying a battered leather journal and speaking broken English, he brought with him a truth so devastating it would shatter everything the missionary community believed about their beloved lost heroes. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of the Peruvian Amazon as Dr. Sarah Mitchell sat in her cramped field office at the Instituto de Investigación Amazónica in Iquitos. At 42, she had spent the better part of her adult life documenting indigenous languages and cultures throughout South America, but the weight of 2 decades in the jungle showed in the premature lines around her eyes and the silver threads weaving through her dark hair. The humid air hung thick around her as she reviewed research notes, the constant symphony of birds and insects providing a backdrop she had long since stopped noticing. Sarah had chosen this isolated life deliberately. After completing her doctorate in anthropological linguistics at Stanford, she could have secured a comfortable position at any major university. Instead, she had fled to the Amazon, driven by a need to lose herself in work that felt meaningful, work that connected her to something larger than the pain she carried. Her colleagues often wondered why someone with her credentials would choose such a demanding and lonely existence. But Sarah rarely spoke about her past or the events that had shaped her decision to dedicate her life to preserving disappearing cultures. The remote research station where she worked consisted of little more than a few corrugated metal buildings connected by wooden walkways, all raised on stilts to protect against seasonal flooding. Solar panels provided minimal electricity, and communication with the outside world remained spotty at best. Sarah had grown to appreciate the isolation, finding solace in the predictable rhythms of her research and the honest simplicity of life. Stripped down to its essentials, she spent her days interviewing indigenous elders, documenting traditional stories, and creating linguistic records of languages that might disappear within a generation. Her current project focused on the Yanapuma people, one of the most reclusive tribes in the region. Unlike many indigenous groups that had adapted to increasing contact with the outside world, the Yanapuma had maintained their traditional lifestyle deep in the forest, rarely interacting with outsiders and fiercely protective of their ancestral territories. Sarah had been working for months to establish trust with tribal leaders, hoping to document their unique dialect before outside influences began to erode their linguistic traditions. The relationship between Sarah and the Yanapuma had developed slowly and carefully. She understood the delicate nature of such cross-cultural work, respecting the tribe's boundaries while demonstrating her genuine interest in preserving rather than exploiting their heritage. Several tribal members had begun to open up to her, sharing stories and language patterns that revealed the complexity and richness of their oral tradition. The work felt important in a way that academic pursuits rarely did, connecting her to something timeless and essential about human experience. On this particular morning, Sarah was transcribing recordings from her latest interview with Taita Yaku, an elderly Yanapuma shaman who had become one of her most trusted sources. His weathered voice emerged from the small digital recorder, speaking in the melodic tones of his native language as he recounted traditional creation stories passed down through countless generations. Sarah worked methodically, her trained ear, picking out phonetic patterns and grammatical structures that would help her create a comprehensive linguistic record. The peaceful routine of her morning was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the wooden walkway outside her office. This was unusual, as the research station rarely received visitors, and the handful of staff members typically moved about their duties with minimal disturbance. Sarah looked up from her work to see Manuel Rodriguez, the station's local coordinator, approaching her door with an expression of barely contained excitement mixed with apprehension. Manuel was a lean man in his 50s who had worked at the research station for over a decade. Born and raised in Iquitos, He served as the vital link between the academic researchers and the local communities, his deep knowledge of the region and its people making him indispensable to the station's operations. His weather-beaten face reflected years of navigating the complex relationships between indigenous groups and outside researchers, and Sarah had come to rely on his judgment and cultural sensitivity. "Dr. Mitchell," Manuel said, his accented English carrying an urgency that immediately captured Sarah's attention. "You need to come see this. There is a man here, a Yanapuma, but he is not like the others you have met. He speaks some English, and he is asking specifically for you." Sarah set down her transcription materials and followed Manuel outside. The humid air hit her immediately as she stepped onto the walkway, and she could hear the distant sound of voices coming from the station's main reception area. As they walked, Manuel continued to explain the unusual circumstances of the visitor's arrival. "He came alone, which is very strange for the Yanapuma," Manuel said, his voice lowered as if sharing a confidence. "Usually they travel in groups, especially when coming to a place like this. And his appearance, Doctora, it is not typical. He looks like he has been through something difficult, something that has changed him." When they reached the main building, Sarah saw the man Manuel had described. He stood near the entrance, and even from a distance it was clear that this was no ordinary tribal visit. The man appeared to be in his 40s, with the distinctive features and traditional dress of the Yanapuma people. But there was something different about his bearing, something that suggested experiences beyond the typical scope of indigenous forest life. His dark skin was marked by scars that seemed too precise to be accidental, and his eyes held a depth of knowledge that went beyond traditional wisdom. He wore a mixture of traditional and modern clothing, forest-dyed cotton combined with what appeared to be remnants of manufactured fabric. Most striking of all, he carried a leather satchel that looked distinctly out of place in the jungle setting, its worn surface suggesting years of careful preservation despite the hostile environment. As Sarah approached, the man looked up and met her eyes directly, a gesture that violated typical Yanapuma cultural protocols regarding interactions with outsiders. When he spoke, his voice carried the distinctive accent of his people, but the words that emerged were clearly recognizable English, albeit heavily accented and grammatically imperfect. "You are the woman who studies our words," he said, his statement carrying the weight of certainty rather than question. "You are the one who listens to our old stories and writes them down so they will not be forgotten." Sarah nodded, struck by the man's direct approach and apparent knowledge of her work. "Yes, I am Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I am a linguist, and I work to preserve indigenous languages and oral traditions. What is your name?" The man hesitated for a moment, as if considering how much of himself to reveal. "I am called Kuyai," he said finally. "In your language this means love, but that is not why I have come to you today. I have come because I carry a burden that has grown too heavy for one man to bear alone." He reached into his leather satchel and withdrew an object that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was a journal, bound in cracked leather and held together with what appeared to be vine cordage. The cover was stained and weathered, but even from a distance, Sarah could see English writing embossed on the front. As Kuye held the journal toward her, she could make out the faded words, "Property of David W. Brennan, Missionary Alliance." 20. Years ago, Kuyai continued, his English becoming more confident as he spoke, 5 men came to our territory. They said they brought a message from their God, a message they wanted to share with my people. They were young and strong and full of certainty about their purpose. He paused, looking down at the journal in his hands. "My people, we thought they were harmless. We thought their God talk was just another form of the confusion that sometimes comes from the outside world." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, despite the oppressive jungle heat. She had heard stories about missionary expeditions that had gone missing in the Amazon, tales that circulated among researchers and indigenous communities alike. The jungle was vast and unforgiving, And it was not uncommon for expeditions to disappear without a trace, their fates becoming the subject of speculation and legend. What happened to them? Sarah asked, though something in Kuyai's expression suggested that the answer would be more complex and disturbing than a simple tale of jungle misfortune. Kuyai opened the journal carefully, revealing pages filled with handwritten text in English. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that the writing was dense and detailed, suggesting extensive documentation of experiences and observations. This belonged to their leader, Kuyai said. David Brennan. He wrote in it every day, recording everything they did, everything they saw, everything they planned to do to bring their God to my people. He closed the journal and looked directly at Sarah again. For 20 years, I have kept this secret, along with others who know the truth. But the weight of what we know, what we did, it has become too much. The ancestors speak to me in dreams, telling me that truth must be spoken, that the families of these men deserve to know what happened to their sons. Sarah realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in her years of research. Indigenous communities rarely shared information about outsiders who had disappeared in their territories, especially when that information might implicate them in those disappearances. The fact that Kuyai had not only preserved the journal, but had sought her out specifically, suggested that whatever had happened to the missionaries had left a profound impact on the Yanapuma community. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Why now, after so many years?" Kuyai shifted the journal in his hands, his expression growing more solemn. "Because you understand our words, our ways. Because you listen without judgment and record truth without changing it. And because," he paused, seeming to gather his courage, "because what happened to those 5 men was not what the outside world believes. It was not accident. It was not simple death in the jungle. It was something that shows the darkness that can live in human hearts, even in the hearts of those who believe they serve the light." The implications of Kuyai's words began to sink in, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being entrusted with sensitive cultural information. But this was different from her usual research. This was not about preserving language or documenting traditions. This was about uncovering truth that had been buried for 2 decades, truth that could have profound implications for families, communities, and organizations far beyond the Amazon basin. "Will you help me tell this story?" Kuyai asked, extending the journal toward her. "Will you help me speak the truth so that the spirits of those 5 men can finally rest?" Part 2. Present-day protagonist. Introduction. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the weathered journal from Kuyai, the leather cover warm from his touch and rough beneath her fingertips. The weight of the book seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it contained more than just paper and ink, but held within its pages the accumulated grief and secrets of 2 decades. She opened it carefully, mindful of the fragile binding, and saw immediately that the pages were filled with neat, methodical handwriting in blue ink that had faded but remained legible despite the harsh jungle conditions. The first entry was dated March 15, 1995, and began with the enthusiastic words of a young man embarking on what he clearly viewed as the adventure of a lifetime. Day 1, finally reached Iquitos after 30 hours of travel. The heat is incredible, but our spirits are high. Tom keeps joking that we're like the apostles heading into uncharted territory, and maybe he's not wrong. We've spent 3 years preparing for this moment, studying the language, learning about the culture, praying for God's guidance. Tomorrow we head into the jungle to find the Yanapuma people and bring them the gospel. Sarah looked up from the journal to find Kuyai watching her, intently, his dark eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and apprehension. Behind him, Manuel waited respectfully, understanding that he was witnessing something significant, even if he couldn't fully grasp its implications. The research station's usual sounds continued around them, the hum of generators, the distant chatter of staff members, the ever-present chorus of jungle life. But Sarah felt as if she had entered a bubble of profound quiet where only she and Kuyai existed. "There is much more," Kuyai said softly. "Many pages of writing, many days of their journey recorded, but also many things that David Brennan could not have known, could not have written, because they happened after—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words in his limited English vocabulary. "After the writing stopped." Sarah nodded, understanding that she was being offered not just a historical document, but access to a story that had been preserved in the collective memory of the Yanapuma people. This was exactly the kind of cross-cultural documentation that had drawn her to the Amazon in the first place, but she couldn't shake the feeling that accepting this responsibility would fundamentally change her life in ways she wasn't prepared for. The truth was that Sarah had come to the Amazon not just to preserve indigenous cultures, but to escape the weight of her own past. 23 years earlier, she had been a different person entirely. Sarah Mitchell, the eldest daughter of Reverend Robert Mitchell, senior pastor of First Baptist Church of Cedar Falls, Iowa. She had grown up in the insulated world of evangelical Christianity, surrounded by certainty and purpose, destined to follow in her father's footsteps or marry someone who would. Her childhood had been filled with church services, youth group activities, mission trips, and the comfortable assumption that God had a clear plan for her life. That certainty had begun to crack during her sophomore year at Wheaton College, where she was studying to become a missionary herself. She had always been intellectually curious, drawn to languages and cultures in ways that sometimes made her feel restless within the confines of her prescribed path. When she took her first anthropology course as an elective, something awakened in her that had been dormant throughout her carefully structured Christian upbringing. The professor, Dr. Elena Vasquez, was a brilliant woman who had spent decades studying indigenous communities throughout Latin America. She spoke with passion about the complexity and richness of cultures that most Americans never knew existed, about languages that contained entire worldviews different from anything Sarah had ever considered. For the first time in her life, Sarah encountered the idea that there might be multiple valid ways of understanding the world, that truth might be more complex and nuanced than the black and white certainties she had been raised to accept. Crisis of faith that followed had been gradual but inexorable. Sarah found herself questioning not just specific doctrines, but the entire framework of belief that had shaped her identity. She began to see her planned missionary career not as a calling to serve God, but as a form of cultural imperialism, an attempt to impose one worldview on people who had developed their own sophisticated understanding of existence over thousands of years. The breaking point had come during her junior year, when she approached her father with her doubts and questions. Reverend Mitchell, a man who had built his career on unwavering certainty, had responded with disappointment and then anger. In his mind, Sarah's intellectual exploration represented not growth, but dangerous rebellion against God's clear will for her life. The conversations that followed had been painful and ultimately destructive, ending with Sarah's decision to transfer to a secular university and pursue a degree in anthropological linguistics. The rift with her family had been profound and lasting. Her parents viewed her career choice as a rejection not just of their plans for her, but of their entire value system. Her younger siblings, still embedded in the church community, had been encouraged to limit their contact with Sarah, lest her worldly influence corrupt their own faith. Over the years, the gulf had only widened, with occasional tense phone calls on holidays serving as the only remaining connection to the family she had once been so close to. Sarah had thrown herself into her academic work with the fervor of a convert, earning her PhD with distinction and immediately seeking the most remote and challenging fieldwork opportunities available. The Amazon had called to her not just because of its linguistic diversity, but because it represented the furthest possible distance from the world she had left behind. Here, among people who had never heard of Christianity, she could focus on preservation rather than conversion, on understanding rather than changing. But the pain of her family's rejection had never fully healed. Even after 2 decades in the jungle, Sarah sometimes woke in the middle of the night, feeling the acute loneliness that came from having chosen intellectual honesty over emotional security. She had found purpose and meaning in her work, but she had never found peace. The indigenous communities she studied had their own rich spiritual traditions, and she respected them deeply, but she had never been able to find a personal faith that could replace what she had lost. Now, holding David Brennan's journal and listening to Kuyai's offer to share the truth about what had happened to 5 young missionaries, Sarah felt the weight of her past pressing against the carefully constructed boundaries of her present life. She couldn't help but see something of her younger self in the enthusiastic words of the journal's first entry. The same fervent certainty she had once possessed. The same unquestioning belief that God had called them to carry truth to people who desperately needed it. "Dr. Mitchell," Kuyai said, interrupting her thoughts, "I know this is difficult for you to understand. In my culture, we do not speak lightly of such things. Death is sacred, and the truth about death even more so. But I have watched you with my people, and I see that you understand the weight of stories. You know that some truths must be preserved, even when they are painful." Sarah closed the journal carefully and looked at the Yanapuma man who had entrusted her with this burden. "Kuyai, what you're asking of me? It's not just about preserving a story. If these missionaries really did die under suspicious circumstances, if there was violence or cover-up involved, then telling their story could have serious consequences. Families would want answers. Organizations would demand investigations. People might want justice or revenge." Kuyai nodded solemnly. "This is why we have waited 20 years. This is why I am the one who comes to you, not one of the elders or the chief. I am prepared for the consequences of speaking truth. My people, they have given me permission to carry this burden alone, so that whatever comes afterward, it will not fall on the tribe as a whole." The morning sun had climbed higher while they spoke, and the humid air was becoming oppressive even in the shade of the research station's covered areas. Sarah could feel sweat beginning to form on her back and forehead, but she barely noticed the physical discomfort. Her mind was racing through the implications of what Kuyai was offering her. If she accepted the journal and agreed to help tell the story of the missing missionaries, she would be stepping back into the world she had spent decades trying to escape. She would have to engage with missionary organizations, evangelical communities, and all the certainties and judgments she had worked so hard to leave behind. But she would also be honoring the trust that Kuyai was placing in her, preserving a truth that might otherwise be lost forever. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sarah said finally. "How did you learn to speak English? It's unusual for the Yanapuma to have such extensive contact with the outside world." For the first time since his arrival, Kuyai's serious expression softened slightly, and Sarah glimpsed something that might have been sadness or regret. "David Brennan taught me," he said quietly. "During the months they stayed with us, before everything went wrong. He was a good teacher, patient and kind. He genuinely wanted to learn our language too, wanted to understand our ways. That is part of what makes this story so difficult to tell." Sarah felt her breath catch. "Months? They stayed with your people for months? But the reports I've heard always said they disappeared immediately after entering Yanapuma territory." "The outside world was told many things that were not true," Kuyai replied. "David and his friends, they lived with us for almost 6 months. They built shelters, learned to hunt and fish, participated in our daily life. They were not just visitors, passing through. They became part of our community, at least for a time." This revelation changed everything Sarah thought she knew about the case. The standard narrative of the missing missionaries had always involved them disappearing shortly after leaving their last known contact point, presumed victims of jungle hazards or hostile indigenous people. But if they had actually integrated into Yanapuma society for an extended period, then their disappearance took on an entirely different character. What changed? Sarah asked. If they were living peacefully with your people, what happened that led to their deaths? Kuyai was quiet. For a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line where the jungle met the sky. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old pain. They came with good hearts, I think, but they also came with blind eyes and deaf ears. They saw only what they expected to see, heard only what they wanted to hear. And when the truth of our world revealed itself to them, when they encountered something that did not fit their understanding of God and evil, he shook his head. Some truths are too large for small minds to hold. Sarah realized that she was being offered not just a story about missing missionaries, but a window into the complex dynamics of cross-cultural contact, the ways that good intentions could collide with reality to produce unexpected and sometimes tragic consequences. This was exactly the kind of work that had drawn her to anthropology in the first place. But the personal connections made it feel more overwhelming than any academic project she had ever undertaken. I need some time to think about this, Sarah said finally. What you're asking of me, it's not something I can decide quickly. There are ethical considerations, practical concerns, personal factors that I need to work through. Kuyai nodded understandingly. I will stay at the village of my cousin, about 1 day's walk from here. When you are ready to hear the full story, send word through Manuel and I will return. But please, he handed her a small woven bag. Keep the journal with you. Read David's words. Understand who he was, what he hoped to accomplish. It will help you decide if his story deserves to be told. After Kuyai left, Sarah returned to her office but found herself unable to concentrate on her usual work. The journal sat on her desk like a challenge, its presence disrupting the careful equilibrium she had built over 20 years of solitary research. She opened it again and began to read more carefully, immersing herself in David Brennan's voice and gradually understanding the man behind the words. David emerged from the pages as someone remarkably similar to her younger self. Intelligent, passionate, committed to serving God but also genuinely curious about the world beyond his own experience. His early entries showed a young man wrestling with the same questions that had once tormented Sarah. The tension between faith and intellectual honesty, between certainty and humility. As she read deeper into the journal, Sarah began to understand that accepting Kuyai's offer would mean more than just documenting a historical event. It would mean confronting her own past, examining the path that had led her to the Amazon, and possibly finding some kind of resolution to the conflicts that had shaped her adult life. The story of the 5 missing missionaries was becoming inseparable from her own story of faith lost and purpose found. Part 3. The Catalyst. Call discovery. The satellite phone in Sarah's office rarely rang, its shrill electronic tone cutting through the jungle ambiance perhaps once or twice a week when supply coordinators or university administrators needed to communicate urgent matters. When it began ringing at 7:30 in the morning, 3 days after Kuyai's visit, Sarah almost ignored it entirely. She had spent the previous evening reading through more of David Brennan's journal entries, and the young missionaries' increasingly conflicted observations about Yanapuma's spiritual practices had left her emotionally drained and questioning her own assumptions about cultural interaction. But the phone continued its insistent ringing, and Sarah finally reached across her cluttered desk to answer it. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, with the slight delay that characterized international satellite communications. Dr. Mitchell? This is James Crawford from the International Missionary Alliance headquarters in Colorado Springs. I apologize for calling so early, but we've been trying to reach you for several days regarding a matter of significant importance to our organization. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The timing of the call, coming so soon after Kuyai's revelation about the missing missionaries, seemed too coincidental to be mere chance. She had deliberately avoided any contact with missionary organizations throughout her career, but somehow her name had reached the attention of the very group that had sponsored David Brennan's expedition 20 years earlier. I'm not sure how. I can help you, Mr. Crawford, Sarah replied carefully. My work focuses on indigenous language preservation, not missionary activities. Yes, we're well aware of your academic credentials, Crawford continued, his tone suggesting access to information that made Sarah uncomfortable. Your reputation for ethical fieldwork and cultural sensitivity has come to our attention through various sources. We understand that you've developed particularly strong relationships with several isolated tribal groups in the Peruvian Amazon, including the Yanapuma people. The mention of the Yanapuma sent alarm bells through Sarah's mind. Either this was an extraordinary coincidence, or someone had informed the Missionary Alliance about her recent contact with Kuyai. Given the remote nature of her location and the limited number of people who knew about the tribesman's visit, the implications were unsettling. Mr. Crawford, I need to ask you directly. Why are you calling me? What exactly does the International Missionary Alliance want from me? There was a brief pause before Crawford responded, and Sarah could hear the sound of papers being shuffled in the background. Dr. Mitchell, I'm calling because we have reason to believe that new information may have surfaced regarding the disappearance of 5 of our missionaries in 1995. David Brennan, Thomas Chen, Michael Rodriguez, James Patterson, and Stephen Walsh were last seen entering Yanapuma territory on March 20th of that year. Despite extensive search efforts, no trace of them was ever found. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. The names Crawford recited matched those she had seen mentioned in David's journal, and hearing them spoken aloud made the reality of their fate feel suddenly more immediate and personal. Our sources suggest, Crawford continued, that you may have recently come into contact with indigenous individuals who possess information about what happened to our missionaries. If this is true, I want to emphasize how crucial it would be for our organization, and for the families of these young men, to finally learn the truth about their fate. What sources? Sarah asked sharply. Who told you I had any information? About your missing missionaries? I'm not at liberty to reveal our sources, Dr. Mitchell, but I can assure you they are reliable. We've been monitoring the region for 20 years, hoping that someday new evidence would emerge. These 5 men represented the best of our organization, young, dedicated, spiritually mature individuals who felt called to bring the gospel to unreached people groups. Their disappearance has haunted our community for 2 decades. Sarah realized that her conversation was being carefully guided by someone who had prepared extensively for this call. Crawford's responses suggested knowledge not just of the missionary's fate, but of her recent contact with Yanapuma representatives. The implications were deeply troubling, suggesting surveillance capabilities that extended far beyond what she would have expected from a religious organization. Mr. Crawford, I appreciate your concern for these missing men and their families, but I'm not sure why you think I can help you. My work with indigenous communities is confidential, and I don't share information about my research subjects with outside organizations. Dr. Mitchell, let me be completely honest with you. Crawford's tone shifted, becoming more urgent and personal. We know that a Yanapuma tribesman visited your research station 3 days ago, carrying what appeared to be documents or artifacts related to our missing missionaries. We know that this individual spent considerable time in private conversation with you, and we know that he left materials in your possession. The explicit detail of Crawford's knowledge sent a chill through Sarah. Someone had been watching the research station, monitoring her activities with a level of sophistication that suggested resources far beyond casual interest. She wondered if her office was under surveillance at that very moment, if her phone conversations were being recorded, if her movements were being tracked. How do you know these things? Sarah demanded. Are you having me watched? The International Missionary Alliance has maintained a presence in the Amazon region for over 30 years, Crawford replied, neither confirming nor denying her suspicions. We have relationships with local communities, government officials, and research organizations throughout Peru and Brazil. When something happens that might relate to our missing personnel, we hear about it. Sarah felt trapped between competing obligations. Her academic training emphasized the importance of protecting indigenous sources and maintaining confidentiality, but she also recognized that the families of the missing missionaries deserved answers about their loved ones' fate. The question was whether she could trust the Missionary Alliance to handle whatever truth Kuyai was prepared to reveal. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Sarah said finally. "We're asking you to cooperate with our investigation into the disappearance of our missionaries," Crawford replied. "If you have access to information or materials related to their fate, we need you to share that information with us. We can provide resources to support a comprehensive investigation, including funding for additional research, security personnel if needed, and coordination with Peruvian authorities." The offer of resources was tempting, but Sarah couldn't shake her suspicion that the Missionary Alliance's interests might not align with her commitment to protecting indigenous communities. Religious organizations had a long history of using academic research to further their evangelical goals, often without concern for the cultural disruption that resulted. "Mr. Crawford, before I can even consider cooperating with your investigation, I need you to answer some questions honestly. First, how long have you been monitoring my research station? Second, what other sources of information do you have about the missing missionaries? And third, what do you intend to do with whatever information emerges from this investigation?" There was a longer pause this time, and Sarah could hear muffled conversation in the background, as if Crawford was consulting with colleagues before responding. "Dr. Mitchell, I understand your concerns, and I want to address them as directly as possible. Our organization has maintained general awareness of research activities in regions where our personnel have operated, but we haven't specifically targeted you for surveillance. When we learned about the Yanapuma contact, it was through routine information sharing with local contacts, not through any covert monitoring." Sarah wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation, but she allowed Crawford to continue. "As for other sources of information, I can tell you that we've never stopped investigating the disappearance of our missionaries. Over the years, we've collected fragments of information from various sources, other indigenous communities, government officials, fellow missionaries who worked in the region. None of these sources provided definitive answers, but they created a pattern that suggested the men might have survived longer than initially believed." This admission aligned with what Kuyai had told her about the missionaries living with the Yanapuma for several months before their disappearance. It also suggested that the Missionary Alliance's knowledge of events was incomplete, making her potential cooperation more valuable than she had initially realized. "Regarding our intentions," Crawford continued, "our primary goal is simply to learn the truth about what happened to these 5 men. Their families have lived with uncertainty for 20 years, not knowing whether their sons and brothers died quickly or suffered, whether they were victims of accident or violence, whether their bodies might someday be recovered for proper burial. Whatever we learn, our first obligation is to provide answers to those families." Sarah appreciated the apparent sincerity in Crawford's voice, but she remained skeptical about the organization's broader agenda. "And if the truth reflects poorly on missionary activities in the Amazon, if what happened to these men resulted from cultural misunderstandings or inappropriate evangelical methods, would you still want that truth revealed?" "Dr. Mitchell, I won't pretend that we wouldn't prefer a narrative that reflects well on our organization and our work. But after 20 years of uncertainty, we're prepared to accept whatever truth emerges. These were good men who believed they were serving God, but they were also human beings who may have made mistakes or encountered situations they weren't prepared to handle." The admission was more honest than Sarah had expected, and it made her more inclined to trust Crawford's stated intentions. But she still felt the weight of responsibility toward Kuyai and the Yanapuma community, who had entrusted her with sensitive information that could have serious consequences if mishandled. "Mr. Crawford, I need time to think about this. If I do have information relevant to your investigation, it was given to me in confidence by people who have good reason to be cautious about outside interference. I can't make any commitments without careful consideration of all the implications." "I understand completely, Dr. Mitchell, and I respect your ethical concerns. But I also want you to understand the urgency of this situation. We have reason to believe that other parties may be interested in this case, parties whose intentions might not be as benevolent as ours. If information about our missing missionaries is going to surface after 20 years, we'd prefer that it surface through channels that will treat all parties fairly. The mention of other interested parties added a new dimension of complexity to the situation. Sarah wondered who else might be tracking developments related to the missing missionaries and what their motivations might be. What other parties? Sarah asked. I can't be specific, but I can tell you that missionary disappearances in remote areas sometimes attract attention from journalists, documentary filmmakers, government officials, and even individuals with personal vendettas against religious organizations. Not all of these parties would necessarily respect the dignity of the indigenous communities involved or the privacy of the families affected. Sarah realized that her decision about whether to cooperate with the Missionary Alliance might ultimately determine how the story of the missing missionaries would be told. If she refused to work with Crawford's organization, the information might still surface through other channels that would be less sensitive to indigenous concerns or academic ethics. How much time do I have to make this decision? Sarah asked. Given the sensitive nature of the situation, we'd prefer to move forward as quickly as possible. Could you give us an answer within the next few days? Sarah agreed to consider the proposal, and the call ended with Crawford providing contact information for follow-up communication. As she set down the satellite phone, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation she had stumbled into. What had begun as a routine day of linguistic research had evolved into a high-stakes negotiation involving multiple parties with potentially conflicting interests. She opened David Brennan's journal again, seeking clarity in the young missionary's own words about his experiences with the Yanapuma people. The entries from his final weeks painted a picture of growing tension and confusion, as David struggled to reconcile his evangelical mission with his increasing appreciation for indigenous spiritual traditions. One entry, dated just 2 weeks, before the journal entries ended, captured David's internal conflict with painful honesty. I came here believing that we were bringing light to people living in darkness, but the longer I stay with the Yanapuma, the more I realize how much they have to teach us about living in harmony with creation and with each other. Tom keeps reminding me that our job is to preach the gospel, not to become anthropologists, but I can't help wondering if we've been asking the wrong questions all along. Reading David's words, Sarah felt a profound connection to the young man's struggle with certainty and doubt. His journey toward cultural understanding paralleled her own path away from evangelical certainty, and she began to understand that telling his story might help her make sense of her own spiritual journey. The decision about whether to cooperate with the Missionary Alliance would ultimately depend on her ability to balance competing loyalties to Kuyai and the Yanapuma people who had trusted her with their truth, to David Brennan and his companions whose story deserved to be told, to their families who deserved answers, and to her own commitment to ethical research practices. As the jungle evening descended around the research station, Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of her carefully ordered life. She would send word to Kuyai that she was ready to hear the full story of what had happened to the 5 missionaries. Only after understanding the complete truth could she decide how that truth should be shared with the world. Part 4. Reluctant. Return investigation. Sarah spent the next morning composing a carefully worded message to send to Kuyai through Manuel's network of contacts in the surrounding villages. The process of crafting the communication forced her to confront the magnitude of what she was undertaking. She was essentially agreeing to become the conduit through which a 20-year-old secret would finally reach the outside world, with all the unpredictable consequences that revelation might bring. The message itself was simple. I am ready to listen to the complete story. Please return when it is safe and convenient for you. But the simplicity of the words belied the complexity of emotions churning beneath Sarah's academic composure. She had built her entire adult life around the principle of careful, methodical research conducted at a safe emotional distance from her subjects. Now she was stepping into territory where personal history, cultural sensitivity, and potentially dangerous political implications intersected in ways she couldn't fully predict or control. Manuel accepted the message with the grave understanding that characterized his approach to all communications involving indigenous communities. He had worked at the research station long enough to recognize when academic work was evolving into something more consequential than routine documentation. "Doctora Mitchell," he said as he prepared to dispatch the message through his network, "I hope you understand what you are beginning. The jungle has many ways of keeping secrets, and when those secrets are disturbed, the consequences can reach far beyond what anyone expects." Sarah nodded, appreciating Manuel's concern while recognizing that she had already passed the point where retreat was possible. The conversation with James Crawford had made it clear that knowledge of the missionaries' fate was already circulating beyond the Yanapuma community. Her choice was not whether the story would emerge, but whether she would play a role in shaping how it was told. While waiting for Kuyai's response, Sarah threw herself into researching everything she could find about the 1995 missionary expedition and its aftermath. The research station's internet connection was frustratingly slow and intermittent, but she managed to access archived news reports, missionary organization publications, and academic papers dealing with cross-cultural contact in the Amazon region. The picture that emerged from these sources was markedly different from the one painted by David Brennan's journal entries. Official reports consistently described the missionaries as having disappeared shortly after entering Yanapuma territory, presumably victims of hostile indigenous people or jungle hazards. The search efforts, according to these accounts, had been extensive, but ultimately fruitless, hampered by the remote location and the Yanapuma people's refusal to cooperate with outside investigators. Sarah found several interviews with family members of the missing missionaries, and their pain was evident even in the formal language of newspaper accounts. David Brennan's mother, speaking to a reporter 6 months after her son's disappearance, had expressed the anguish of not knowing. "We just want to know what happened to our boy. Did he suffer? Is he still alive somewhere? Without answers, we can't even properly grieve." The disconnect between the official narrative and David's journal entries troubled Sarah deeply. If the missionaries had indeed lived with the Yanapuma for several months, as Kuyai claimed, and David's writing suggested, then the search efforts had either been deliberately misdirected or had failed to uncover obvious evidence of their extended presence in the area. She also discovered references to other missionary disappearances in the Amazon region during the 1990s, suggesting a pattern of evangelical expeditions encountering difficulties that were often attributed to indigenous hostility or natural hazards. The academic literature on the subject was sparse, but consistent in its criticism of missionary methods that failed to account for the complexity of indigenous worldviews and social structures. One paper, published in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Studies, examined the psychological impact of evangelical conversion attempts on isolated indigenous communities. The author argued that missionary activities often created internal conflicts within traditional societies, pitting individuals who were attracted to Christian teachings against those who saw such influences as threats to cultural integrity. These tensions, the paper suggested, sometimes led to violence that was subsequently blamed on generalized indigenous hostility rather than on the specific disruptions caused by missionary presence. Reading this research, Sarah began to formulate theories about what might have happened to David Brennan and his companions. If they had indeed integrated into Yanapuma society for an extended period, their presence would have inevitably created tensions within the community. Some tribal members might have welcomed their message while others resisted it. The resulting conflicts could have escalated in ways that the missionaries, despite their good intentions, were unprepared to handle. 3 days after sending her message to Kuyai, Sarah received word that he would return to the research station the following morning. She spent the evening preparing for the interview, setting up recording equipment and reviewing her notes on indigenous oral tradition and cross-cultural communication techniques. The academic preparations helped calm her nerves, but they couldn't entirely suppress her anxiety about what she was about to learn. Kuyai arrived at dawn, accompanied this time by an elderly Yanapuma woman whom he introduced as Mama Chuya, one of the tribal elders who had witnessed the events he was prepared to describe. Her presence added gravitas to the proceedings and suggested that the Yanapuma community was taking the revelation of their secrets very seriously. Mama Chuya spoke no English, but her weathered features and penetrating gaze conveyed a dignity and wisdom that transcended language barriers. She wore traditional Yanapuma dress, her gray hair braided with colorful threads, and her arms decorated with intricate geometric tattoos that marked her status as a keeper of tribal knowledge. "She has come to make sure I tell the story correctly," Kuyai explained as they settled into Sarah's office. "Among our people, important stories must be witnessed by elders to ensure they are preserved accurately." Mama Chuya was present for everything that happened with the 5 missionaries. Sarah activated her recording equipment and opened a fresh notebook, but before beginning the formal interview, she felt compelled to address the ethical dimensions of what they were undertaking. "Kuyai, before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand what might happen once this story becomes known outside your community. There will likely be investigations, possibly involving government officials and international organizations. Journalists might come to your territory seeking additional information. The families of the missing missionaries will want to visit the places where their sons lived and died. Are you and your people prepared for this level of outside attention?" Kuyai translated her concerns to Mama Chuya, and the two of them engaged in a lengthy discussion in their native language. Sarah could tell from their tone and gestures that they were carefully weighing the implications of their decision to reveal the truth. Finally, Kuyai turned back to Sarah. "Mama Chuya says that we have carried this burden for too long. The spirits of the 5 men have not been at peace, and their restlessness has affected our community in ways that outsiders cannot understand. She believes that speaking the truth will finally allow everyone, the dead missionaries, their families, and our people, to find peace." The elder woman spoke directly to Sarah in Yanapuma, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Kuyai translated. "She says that you have been chosen to receive this story not by accident, but by the ancestors who guide all important decisions. She has dreamed of a woman with pale skin and kind eyes who would help our people tell this difficult truth. She believes you are that woman." Sarah felt the weight of spiritual responsibility that she had not experienced since her youth in evangelical Christianity. The difference was that Mama Chuya's faith felt inclusive rather than exclusive, embracing mystery rather than demanding certainty. "Tell me what happened," Sarah said simply, activating the recording device and opening David Brennan's journal to the final entries. Kuyai began speaking in a measured cadence that suggested he had rehearsed this narrative many times in his own mind, waiting for the right moment to share it with the outside world. "When the 5 missionaries first came to our territory in March 1995, they were not the first outsiders we had encountered, but they were different from the others. Most foreigners who entered our lands were either government officials demanding compliance with laws we did not understand, or researchers who wanted to study us like insects under a microscope. David and his companions came with a different purpose. They wanted to live with us, to learn our language, to understand our ways of life." Sarah noticed that Kuyai's English became more fluent and precise as he settled into the rhythm of storytelling, suggesting that he had practiced this narrative extensively. At first, our elders were suspicious. We had heard stories from other tribes about missionaries who came with gifts and kind words, but ultimately sought to destroy traditional ways of life. Some of our people wanted to turn them away immediately, but David spoke with such sincerity about his desire to learn from us that even the most skeptical elders agreed to give them a chance. Mama Chuya interjected with a comment in Yanapuma, and Kuyai nodded before continuing. "Mama Chuya reminds me that David was different from the others even in the beginning. Tom, Michael, James, and Stephen came with clear ideas about what they wanted to teach us about their God. But David asked questions. He wanted to understand our beliefs before trying to change them. This made him both the most respected and the most dangerous of the five. Sarah looked up from her notes. Dangerous? In what way? Because a man who truly listens to other people's beliefs might begin to doubt his own, Kuyai replied. David's companions worried that he was becoming too interested in our spiritual practices, too willing to see wisdom in traditions they considered primitive or even evil. The narrative that emerged over the next several hours painted a complex picture of cultural encounter that defied the simple categories of missionary success or failure. The five young men had indeed established themselves within Yanapuma society, building shelters, learning hunting and fishing techniques, and gradually becoming accepted as temporary members of the community. David Brennan, as his journal entries suggested, had thrown himself into the process of cultural learning with an enthusiasm that sometimes troubled his companions. He had studied Yanapuma language intensively, participated in traditional ceremonies, and developed close friendships with tribal members who appreciated his genuine curiosity about their worldview. The other missionaries had struggled more with the ambiguities of cross-cultural living. They had come to the Amazon with clear expectations about their role as teachers and evangelists, but they found themselves in situations that required them to be students and observers instead. The journal entries that Sarah had read reflected David's growing comfort with this reversal of roles, but Kuyai's narrative suggested that his companions had become increasingly uncomfortable with the blurring of cultural boundaries. The problems began, Kuyai continued, when the dry season ceremonies started in August. These are the most sacred rituals of our people, when we communicate directly with the spirits of our ancestors and receive guidance for the coming year. David wanted to participate, to understand our spiritual practices from the inside. His companions were horrified. Sarah could imagine the theological crisis this situation would have created for evangelical missionaries trained to view indigenous spiritual practices as demonic or superstitious. Their commitment to bringing Christian truth to unreached people would have put them in direct conflict with David's anthropological curiosity. What happened during the ceremonies? Sarah asked. Kuyai and Mama Chuya exchanged another lengthy conversation in Yanapuma before he answered. This is where the story becomes difficult to tell, because it involves sacred knowledge that we do not usually share with outsiders. But Mama Chuya says that the spirits themselves have given permission for this truth to be spoken. The elder woman began speaking directly, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of traditional storytelling. Kuyai translated as she spoke, preserving both the content and the ceremonial tone of her narrative. During the ancestor ceremony, the 5 missionaries were invited to observe from a respectful distance. Our people wanted to honor them as guests while protecting the sacred nature of the ritual. David accepted this arrangement, but Tom became angry. He said that their God did not want them to witness devil worship, and he demanded that all 5 missionaries leave the ceremonial area immediately. Sarah could sense the narrative building toward its climactic moment, but she also felt the weight of responsibility for whatever revelation was coming. The story Kuyai and Mama Chuya were sharing would inevitably become public knowledge, with consequences that would ripple through multiple communities and organizations. David refused to leave, Kuyai continued. He said that understanding our beliefs was part of his mission, that he could not serve his God effectively if he remained ignorant of our spiritual practices. The argument between David and Tom became very heated, and the other 3 missionaries were forced to choose sides. The fracture within the missionary group, Sarah realized, had been the beginning of their downfall. United, they might have navigated the cultural challenges they encountered. Divided, they had become vulnerable to forces they didn't understand and couldn't control. The tension in Sarah's office was palpable as Kuyai continued his narrative, with Mama Chuya occasionally interjecting corrections or additional details in rapid Yanapuma that he would then translate. The elderly woman's presence lent an air of ceremonial gravity to the proceedings, as if they were participating in a sacred ritual rather than conducting an academic interview. The division among the missionaries created a crisis that none of them understood. Kuyai continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of traditional storytelling. In our culture, when guests disagree among themselves about sacred matters, it creates spiritual imbalance that can affect the entire community. The elders held emergency councils to discuss what should be done. Sarah paused her note-taking to look directly at Kuyai. What did the elders decide? Mama Chuya spoke at length, her weathered hands gesturing expressively as she recounted events that had clearly remained vivid in her memory for 2 decades. Kuyai listened intently before translating. She says that the elders were divided, just as the missionaries were. Some believed that the 5 men should be asked to leave our territory immediately, before their conflicts could contaminate our sacred ceremonies. Others argued that David's genuine respect for our traditions deserved recognition, and that forcing all 5 to leave would punish the innocent along with the disruptive. The complexity of the situation was becoming clearer to Sarah as the narrative unfolded. This was not a simple story of indigenous people rejecting missionary interference, but rather a nuanced account of a community struggling to balance hospitality with spiritual protection, individual relationships with collective welfare. There was a third faction among the elders, Kuyai continued, led by my grandfather, Taita Sumak, who believed that the missionaries' presence had been orchestrated by the spirits for a purpose that none of us yet understood. He argued that turning them away without understanding that purpose could bring misfortune to our people. Sarah found herself thinking about the theological implications of this indigenous perspective on missionary presence. While the evangelical view would interpret their arrival as part of God's plan to bring salvation to unreached peoples, the Yanapuma understanding suggested a more complex spiritual dynamic in which all parties might be transformed by the encounter. Mama Chuya spoke again, this time with evident emotion, and Sarah could see tears forming in her eyes as she recounted particularly painful memories. She is remembering David during this time, Kuyai translated. He came to her privately and asked to learn about our healing ceremonies. His friend Stephen had developed a fever that their medicines could not cure, and David wanted to understand if our traditional remedies might help. This detail aligned with entries in David's journal that Sarah had read, references to Stephen's illness, and David's growing interest in indigenous medical practices. But hearing the story from Mama Chuya's perspective added emotional depth that the written record couldn't capture. Mama Chuya agreed to teach David about healing herbs and ceremonies. Kuyai continued. She says he was a quick learner, respectful of the spiritual dimensions of healing, willing to participate in the rituals even though he didn't fully understand them. Stephen's fever broke after 3 days of traditional treatment. Sarah could imagine how this success would have further widened the rift between David and his companions. Tom and the others would have seen David's participation in indigenous healing ceremonies as dangerous compromise with paganism, while David would have viewed it as practical compassion guided by divine providence. But Tom was furious when he learned what David had done. Kuyai confirmed Sarah's speculation. He accused David of betraying their mission and endangering all their souls by participating in what he called demonic rituals. The argument that followed was so intense that it could be heard throughout the village. Mama Chuya added another comment, and Kuyai nodded gravely before translating. She says that during this argument, Tom said something that frightened everyone who heard it. He declared that if David would not abandon his interest in our devil worship, then Tom would take whatever steps necessary to protect the integrity of their mission. The ominous nature of Tom's threat sent a chill through Sarah as she contemplated its implications. She was beginning to understand that the missionaries' disappearance might have resulted not from external violence, but from internal conflicts that had escalated beyond their ability to resolve peacefully. What happened next? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Kuyay was quiet for a long moment, consulting with Mama Chuya in their native language before continuing. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of memories that had clearly haunted him for 20 years. The final crisis came during the ceremony of the ancestors, our most sacred ritual. David had been specifically invited to participate by Taita Sumak, who believed that the spirits had chosen David to receive important knowledge. But when Tom learned of the invitation, he threatened to physically prevent David from attending. Sarah could visualize the scene. 5 young missionaries, thousands of miles from home, struggling with theological and personal conflicts they had never been trained to handle, surrounded by an indigenous community trying to balance hospitality with spiritual protection. On the night of the ceremony, Kuyay continued, David came to the sacred grove as invited. Tom followed him, along with Michael and James, intending to forcibly remove him. Only Stephen remained at their shelter, still recovering from his fever. Mama? Chuya spoke again, her voice dropping to almost a whisper as she recounted the events that had traumatized her community for 2 decades. The ceremony had already begun when Tom and the others arrived, Kuyay translated. Our people were in communication with the ancestors, in a sacred trance state that should never be interrupted by violence or conflict. But Tom pushed his way into the ceremonial circle and grabbed David, trying to drag him away. Sarah felt her breath catch as she realized they were approaching the climactic moment of the narrative, the point where misunderstanding and cultural conflict had transformed into irreversible tragedy. What our people experienced next, Kuyay said slowly, was something that challenged everything we thought we understood about the spirit world and the nature of good and evil. He paused, looking to Mama Chuya for permission to continue. The elderly woman nodded solemnly, speaking a few words that Kuyay translated as a traditional blessing invoking protection for those who speak difficult truths. When Tom grabbed David and tried to pull him from the ceremonial circle, something extraordinary happened. David resisted, not just physically, but spiritually. Those who were watching say that David's eyes changed, that he seemed to become someone else entirely. Someone with knowledge and power that went far beyond anything a young missionary should have possessed. Sarah leaned forward, recognizing that she was about to hear something that would challenge her own assumptions about the nature of reality and spiritual experience. David spoke to Tom in perfect Yanapuma, though he had been learning our language for only a few months. But more than that, he spoke with the voice and authority of Taita Sumak's grandfather, a powerful shaman who had died decades before David was born. He commanded Tom to release him and leave the sacred grove immediately. The implications of this claim were staggering. If Kuyay's account was accurate, David Brennan had experienced some form of spiritual possession or channeling during this Yanapuma ceremony, speaking with knowledge and linguistic ability that exceeded his normal capabilities. Tom was terrified, Kuyay continued. He believed that David had been possessed by demons, that the indigenous ceremony had opened him to evil spiritual forces. Michael and James were equally frightened, but they interpreted what they saw differently. They thought David had somehow become a powerful sorcerer. Sarah realized that the theological framework the missionaries brought to the Amazon had no category for understanding indigenous spiritual experiences as potentially legitimate encounters with the divine. Their dualistic worldview, which divided spiritual phenomena into categories of godly or demonic, had made it impossible for them to interpret David's experience in any terms other than supernatural threat. What did Tom do? Sarah asked. Mama Chuya spoke at length, her voice filled with old grief as she recounted events that had clearly traumatized everyone involved. Tom believed that David's soul was in mortal danger, Kuyay translated. In his mind, the only way to save his friend was to remove him immediately from what he saw as demonic influence. But David, still speaking with the voice of the ancestor spirit, refused to leave. He said that he had been chosen to receive important knowledge that would benefit both his people and ours. The tragic irony of the situation was becoming clear to Sarah. David's spiritual experience, which might have represented a breakthrough in cross-cultural understanding and religious dialogue, had instead precipitated a crisis that his companions were incapable of handling constructively. The struggle between Tom and David became violent, Kuyai continued. Michael and James tried to help Tom restrain David, while our people tried to protect the sanctity of the ceremony. In the confusion and darkness, someone struck David in the head with a ceremonial stone. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized that they had reached the moment of irreversible tragedy, the point where cultural misunderstanding had transformed into accidental death. "Was it Tom who struck him?" Sarah asked. Kuyai shook his head. "No one knows for certain. It was dark. There were many people moving around the ceremonial fire, and everyone was either frightened or in a trance state. The stone could have been thrown by Tom or Michael or James trying to break David's supposed possession, or it could have been thrown by one of our people trying to protect the ceremony from disruption." The ambiguity surrounding David's death added another layer of complexity to an already tragic situation. Without clear responsibility for the fatal blow, both the missionaries and the Yanapuma community had been left to grapple with guilt and uncertainty. "David died instantly," Kuyui continued. "The ancestor spirit that had been speaking through him departed, and he became just a young man again, bleeding on the sacred ground of our most important ceremony." Mama Chuya spoke again, tears flowing freely down her weathered cheeks as she remembered the horror of that night. "She says that David's death contaminated the ceremony and created spiritual chaos that affected our entire community," Kuyai translated. "The ancestors became silent, our traditional healing methods stopped working properly, and several of our elders became ill with mysterious ailments that lasted for months." Sarah began to understand why the Yanapuma community had kept this story secret for 20 years. From their perspective, David's death had not been simply a tragic accident, but a spiritual catastrophe that had disrupted their relationship with the sacred world. "What happened to Tom, Michael, and James?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "They were terrified and grief-stricken," Kuyai replied. "They believed they had witnessed demonic possession followed by either divine judgment or satanic murder. Stephen, still weak from his fever, was completely overwhelmed when they brought him the news of David's death." The narrative that emerged over the next hour painted a picture of 4 traumatized young men struggling to make sense of events that exceeded their theological and psychological framework for understanding reality. They had come to the Amazon with clear certainties about good and evil, about their role as God's representatives to pagan peoples, about the nature of spiritual warfare. But their encounter with indigenous spirituality had challenged every assumption they held about how the divine operated in the world. The elders held emergency councils to decide what should be done, Kuyai continued. Some demanded that the remaining missionaries be banished immediately before their presence could cause further spiritual contamination. Others argued that they were now our responsibility, since David's death had occurred during our ceremony, regardless of who had actually struck the fatal blow. Sarah could see how the situation had become impossible for everyone involved. The missionaries were too traumatized and theologically confused to function effectively, while the Yanapuma community was dealing with spiritual crisis that their traditional methods seemed unable to resolve. My grandfather, Taita Sumak, proposed a solution that satisfied no one but seemed necessary for everyone's survival, Kuyai said. He suggested that the 4 surviving missionaries should be allowed to live with us indefinitely, but as students, rather than teachers, learning our ways of healing the spiritual damage that had been done. The irony was profound. The evangelical missionaries who had come to convert indigenous people to Christianity had instead been converted into students of indigenous spirituality by circumstances beyond their control or understanding. But as Sarah would soon learn, this fragile arrangement had not lasted long, and the final tragedy that befell Tom, Michael, James, and Stephen would prove even more disturbing than David's accidental death during the ceremony. The truth about what happened to the remaining 4 missionaries would challenge everything Sarah thought she understood about human nature, spiritual experience, and the deadly consequences of cultural misunderstanding in isolated communities where normal social controls had broken down completely. If you've been captivated by this incredible true story of mystery, faith, and cultural collision in the Amazon rainforest, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more shocking revelations and untold stories that will challenge everything you think you know about history, spirituality, and human nature. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.